This is Colleen Gowlett at Billingshurst with James and Rupert.
Good enough. Hi.
Hello. If you could just take me for a little wander around and point out a few points of interest.
Okay, no, tremendous. Lots to see.
Yeah. Okay, so this is John Cherry. Can you...
John Cherry, I love it. Well, I'm afraid he's going to have to lose his cherry because he's actually John Cheere.
Wrong as well when I was looking at it in the catalogue.
That's it, doesn't matter, it doesn't detract from him being a wonderful thing. He's a lead figure of a mower. He's by John Cheere, who's one of the leading 18th century lead makers in England, and he's probably made in the middle of the 18th century, and he's rare. We haven't sold this model before. The vast majority of all the 18th century lead figures that were actually made, I think, over the years have fallen to bits, fallen down, been melted down for ammunition, whatever. So when you do see an 18th century lead figure, it's rare.
And we know who it was made by because there's another example at Bicton House, and they've still got the original bill from John Cheere, so that's why we're able to say this was made by John Cheere.
It's also worth remembering that the vast majority of the lead that we see is actually made in the 20th century rather than the 18th century. And most of the 20th century lead is actually copying 18th century lead. So often we get sent photographs of urns, figures and things like that. Oh, it's 18th century, and it's not. It's purely a copy. And there are some real pointers in all of this. In the 18th century, the quality of chiselling and engraving was much higher. They were also made usually using a lost wax process, rather like a bronze would be. And if you look at his face and his hair, you'll see amazing details of chiselling on even the eyebrows and things like that, and hair. It's all very carefully delineated.
We've got a pair of urns by probably the other leading name in the 18th century, which will give you a much better demonstration of chiselling and punchwork on lead, and thereby Van Nost.
Okay. Is that something that's been lost over the years then, the quality, do you think?
I think it's all about
As
labour.
labour cost goes up, less and less can be done. It's just the economics don't add up.
And also the other thing is that most of the figures now, lead figures now, are actually made using a slush casting process, which is very good, but it doesn't give you the sort of detail that these do. But let's go and have a look. Anyway, we've got an estimate on him of £30,000 to £50,000 because he is rare. Well, Colleen, when these pair of urns came into us, we couldn't figure them out because the quality is truly, truly stunning. Yeah. But the patina of the lead is terrible. And we found out through Paul Crowther, who's one of the leading lead restorers in the country and also lead maker, that in fact he'd repaired these 20 years ago, and they were absolutely period, but he'd had to strip off all the patina because they were covered with layers of paint. Okay. But if you look at this wonderful punchwork decoration here, and you look at the cherub's faces, it is just of the highest quality in terms of the engraving and chasing. And funny enough, we weren't sure who to attribute these to until we went up to Melbourne Hall in Derbyshire last week, and up there it's one of the best collections of lead by John Van Nost in the country. And one of the things they have is that fantastic monkey urn, which is basically a huge lead urn supported on these monkeys. And the detail of the cherubs' heads on that urn and on these are very, very similar. So we now feel confident attributing these to John Van Nost, who together with Cheere are probably the two leading makers of lead in the 18th century. We've got an estimate of 20 to 30,000 on these, but we're hoping that'll be exceeded because rare as rocking horse droppings.
Who do you see buying these?
Who do I see buying these? I'd like to say that it's actually quite an acquired taste. I suspect it'll be bought by someone in England.
What's the estimate on this piece?
Our Star-Crossed Lovers, Romeo and Juliet, by a chap called Oscar Spalmack, dated Roma 1893. We've got an estimate of 25 to 40,000 on it.
Is that affected by the
Yeah,
That's
very much
amazing.
so. The surface is actually gone in some ways, and also you've got these really curious sort of holes in the marble, which we can't figure out whether that's natural or whether it's how it's happened. I guess if this was in absolutely indoor condition, it would probably be worth 60,000 to 80,000 pounds, maybe even a bit more. But funny enough, we sold this to a client in Germany in 1989, I think, together with a bunch of other things, and they've all come back into us. And I'm glad to say that I think we've actually we sold it for £10,000, so we've now got 25 to 40 on it. So hopefully he's going to make a good return on his money. So there is investment potential in garden statuary.
Does that happen a lot? You see things coming round in circles?
I think it's a sign that I've been here for too long. The fact that now it's a whole generation and the stuff is beginning to come round in circles. Not all of it am I pleased to see again, but most of it I am.
Okay.
Well, having told you how wonderful all 18th century lead is, here's a really cracking example of a bit of 20th century lead. It's made by the Bromsgrove Guild, which was started by a Mr. Gilbert in the early years of the 20th century, and they created very, very high quality garden pieces in lead, in composition stone, but also they worked in wrought and cast iron as well. They actually made the gates and all the railings for Buckingham Palace, so quite well known. And this was actually modelled by a chap called Louis Weingarten, who was a Swiss worker, and it was very much a sort of not a cooperative, but very much relying on craftsman-based rather than mass-produced. Always cracking quality. If you look at his foot,
Yeah.
I mean that is exactly what a child's foot looks like. It is just modelled terrifically well, with great detail, very naturalistic. So I think the estimate on him, even though he's just over 100 years old, I think we've got 12 to 18,000 on him. So with a lot of these contemporary pieces, they also look great in roof gardens. And you think about what a London house now costs, and up on a top roof garden, nicely lit and things like that. I mean, some of these, real wow factor.
I think that's the same with your fossils, and I
Yes.
think that's very good for
Yeah.
London roof garden.
Well, we've very much, with fossil, I mean, neither Rupert or I are particularly scientific. We market it very much as fossil decoration. In other words, although we can say to you, look, this is actually a very rare specimen because, we want to actually look at it as basically Mother Nature at its very best.
Yeah. What's your biggest contemporary name that you have here?
I think the biggest name we've probably got is Claude Leland. We've got a pair of two wonderful bronze chairs, which were actually only conceived in the 1980s for a museum garden out in the States. They're rare. We've got something like £40,000 on each one, but they're fiercely trendy. That's the way the market's going. And Colleen, you said to me earlier that you like them. So
Yes, if I had a spare 40,000. What kind of locations would people put this contemporary sculpture in?
well, I mentioned earlier, Colleen, about the idea of the roof garden, but the sort of corollary to that actually is that I think if you put a piece of contemporary sculpture in the middle of a big, wide open space, green space, I think it looks fantastic with loads of space around it. And so if you've got a big garden, you can actually, in theory, fill it up with actually just a few bits of contemporary sculpture. You put an urn, a traditional 19th century cast iron urn on a pedestal in the middle of a sort of field or a big open space, it looks stupid.
Yeah.
So for me, that's where you've got an advantage with contemporary sculpture, is you can actually make it stretch quite a long way.
What's the difference between people that would buy the contemporary sculpture as the old sculpture?
This is going to be a gross generalisation, but I think we're in a new millennium. There's a lot of new money about. A lot of young guys and girls have made a lot of money, and those, if you like, are more of our core buyers for the contemporary sculpture. New money quite often likes new art, and we're in a new century.
So they would buy new art more for the visual appeal, whereas the older pieces would be bought for value and...
Not necessarily. I think that it's easier to put contemporary sculpture on a blank canvas in your garden, in other words, just in a complete plain area. Whereas for some of the more traditional things like sets of urns or 19th century sculpture or whatever, people tend to use them to enhance existing schemes.